I'm pleased, very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce Mark Freeman, professor of psychology at Holy Cross University, and in my opinion, one of the most insightful, provocative, and engaging theorists of narrative and narrative practices in the world. Freeman's work over the last 30 years calls attention to what storytelling does, how it normalizes as well as how it can transgress, how the stories we tell are constrained by patterns of relationship, culture, and history, which stories get told and which remain untold, how stories can heal and how they can damage. Thanks to Mark's work, we now possess a corpus of captivating narrative concepts such as narrative integrity, the narrative unconscious, moral lateness, and narrative foreclosure, among a number of others. Mark's previous books include Rewriting the Self, History, Narrative, Hindsight, The Promise and Peril of Looking Backward, and The Priority of the Other, Thinking and Living Beyond the Self. And of course, the one we are here to discuss today, Do I Look at You with Love? Reimagining the Story of Dementia. Mark has referred to our friendship over the past 16 years as kindred spirits, insofar as most of our contact has been confined to email and a distinct impression that though we have worked in different disciplines, we have long been on much the same wavelength. I say much the same because we both acknowledge our appetite for concepts and theory and a desire for a more humane, aesthetic, and poetic kind of scientific inquiry, though the priorities we give to each avenue of expression at times can vary considerably. We did not rehearse this session, preferring instead to let it evolve as it may, though I do hope we can reserve some time, perhaps the last 10 or 15 minutes, for comments and questions from those in attendance. And of course, I encourage you all to use the comments on the sidebar. I have a brief testimonial that I wrote immediately after reading Do I Look at You with Love for the first time, but I'm going to hold off on that. I might have an opportunity to read some of it if the occasion seems right as we progress in this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark here at the beginning to say whatever he wants to say specifically about this book and what it meant to write it. Mark?
Thanks so much, Art, for those kind words and for your friendship. It's really a pleasure to be here and it's an honor to be here. So thank you for that. I want to try to share some images if I can figure out how to do it. So let me do that.
Oh, there we go.
Just trying to do one thing here.
Are you going to play the slideshow, Mark?
I'm going to try.
Okay, left side from beginning. There you go, right there.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. There we go.
There you go.
You know, it doesn't seem to be doing it.
You may have to click on each one individually.
No, usually I've been able to do it, but you know what? I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move on.
Can you hit your space bar? Have you tried your space bar?
Let me see.
Oh, there you go. There's your, I could see it. Yeah.
There you go. Great. Okay. Oh, wonderful.
It's doing some strange things. So I'm going to move on to some comments. I at least was able to give you some sense of the trajectory of her life. For over a decade, I sought to tell the story of my mother, who was stricken with dementia back in 2004. Paralleling each chapter of her life during this period were my own written chapters. Many of the episodes were tragic. A vibrant, intelligent woman was being taken down by a dreaded disease. And at times it seemed that the only story to be told was one of painful demise. Others, though, were quite beautiful and called for a lighter touch. Once my mother left us back in 2016 at age 93, it was time to draw together the various chapters of her life into a larger story. The challenge was how to tell it. Ultimately, the story emerged as a kind of tragicomic. That is, a story that includes the full range of lived experience from the awful to the awesome. And that's what I want to convey in the few moments that we have together today. In what follows, I'm going to bring you quickly through 4 somewhat distinct phases of my mother's life and mine since the time of her diagnosis. These comprise the body of the book. I call these phases, these chapters, protest, present, dislocation, and finally release. Rather than just discussing them, what I wanted to do is read a few passages from each of them. This, I hope, will make the substance of the book and of my mother's life that much more vivid and real. Protest. I'll begin at the beginning when Mom landed at Tatnock Park, an assisted living place in Worcester. It was pretty hellish at times. Having no memory of our having visited a number of different places before choosing that one, she was convinced she'd been put there against her will. And having no memory of our having visited her frequently, she'd sometimes speak of being alone and abandoned. She'd sometimes get very angry too. And there wasn't a blessed thing we could do to stop it. I think I would know if you were here, she might say. Well, I might have responded, apparently you don't. Those times hurt. To give all that care to someone and have the response be resentment over what you're supposedly not doing was tough. But you learn to take it. There's really nothing else you can do. The main thing that was hard to endure, though, was seeing my mother coming undone and seeing her suffer on account of it. One of the other things that was really hard for her at the time was the fact that she'd suddenly found herself among all these old people with walkers and wheelchairs and all manner of brokenness. What was she doing there anyway? She wondered. People there saw her as different too. When there was a fashion show, she was the model. And when they had their annual holiday gathering, she'd be working the crowd like a pro. Always liked a good party. She'd dance sometimes too, and people would marvel at her moves and her grace, her ability to still groove. And one year, I can't recall the exact event, she was somehow chosen as the belle of the ball or the prom queen or whatever it was. And alongside the king, danced the night away. Some good times. But then she'd sink back, either in protest or rage or utter confusion. The protests were vehement. I know I can still drive just fine, she'd say. I've always taken care of my own papers. I've never been late with a check. And when I questioned these abilities, as was sometimes necessary, or at least seemed so, her response could be swift and sharp. I'm not an imbecile, or you're treating me like a child. What do you want? I asked her one day. I want to be a person, she said. At this stage then, I wrote, there was a severe disjunction between what my mother was and what she was in the process of becoming. A once able but no longer person. And she knew it. It was just as if everything was crashing down. All the things that defined her in her own eyes were coming undone. She was coming undone, and she felt it acutely. What made the process even more confusing and painful was that she really didn't know why. Little wonder that she protested as vehemently as she did. Presence. Eventually, I began to see a correlation of sorts, one that in its own tragic way promised a measure of reprieve for my mother as well as for me. The more her ego was on the line, her competence and self-sufficiency and autonomy, the more painful things would be. And the more her ego was set aside, listening to music, going for a nice drive, going out for a good meal, the more at home in the world she'd be. It was around this time that I realized that as her dementia got worse, she herself would likely feel less tortured by her life. And maybe with the continued loss of self, I also wondered, maybe she'd even be able to experience a kind of carefree oneness, an unself-conscious immersion into the world. This is what I would eventually call dementia's tragic promise. Here's a passage from the book that speaks to this. It was one of those fall days in New England that demanded your attention. Mom and I decided to take a drive up a country road toward Mount Wachusett, which offers vistas of the lush valley below, the mountains of New Hampshire to the north. And on a crystal clear day like that one, the Boston skyline. I tuned the car stereo to a local classical station, and up we went, climbing the road to the mountain, music playing, the sky blue, the leaves beginning to turn, shaking loose, skittering across the road. She was transfixed. Beautiful, she said. It must be peak now. Such a pretty road. Beautiful, beautiful day. What a day. Spectacular day for a ride like this. What a spectacular, beautiful day. Each statement she made, even if exactly the same as the one uttered the minute before, was brand new. For a moment or two, and I assure you only for a moment or two, I envied her. That day, I really couldn't be there with the world like she was. I kept moving in and out between the welter of colors and this or that issue that had to be thought about. Between the incredible vistas and my mother's fate. That day, though, for a few hours, she was happy, or something like it. I can't pretend to know exactly where she was, but wherever it was, it did seem to bring her a kind of oneness, a full immersion in the world, untouched by all the chattering stuff inside our heads that keeps us from being present to things. During this too brief phase, this is how it was. Wondrous at times. Dementia's tragic promise in the form of a kind of ecstatic presence. Dislocation. Whatever envy I might have had during the phase I just described, he was cast aside later that year. Because instead of that seemingly selfless state of carefree abandon that would sometimes come her way, she'd frequently experience a kind of existential dislocation, such that everything would become utterly alien. Waking up in the morning, she was generally okay. The routines began and she could make her way through them without getting too disturbed. But she'd sometimes wake up after an afternoon nap only to find herself completely lost. In a distinct sense, where am I would become fused with, where am I? The result could be sheer terror. There was another result too. She needed to find me immediately, and she sometimes called frantically, trying to reach me. One night, with the help of one of the aides, she called in a panic and told me in a shaky voice that she was at Holy Cross. I doubt that, Mom, I said. You're at home at Tatnick Park. She then asked the aide where she was. You're in your own apartment where you've been living. Well, that's news to me. My voice calmed her down. You'll be okay, Mom, I said. This happens once in a while, but eventually things start to look familiar again. So just take it easy. I'll be over in a little while. These rescue efforts became quite a heavy responsibility. Not only did I need to be on call, my mother's very sense of location in a recognizable world had come to depend in part on me. I could help return her to the world and to herself, such as it was, at least for a while. One day I stopped by her apartment to say hello. Mom was sitting on a comfortable sofa by the fireplace. As I walked toward her, I could see that she was anxious and uncomfortable. It's a good thing you showed up when you did, she said. Why? I asked. She had absolutely no idea what she was doing there. Do I stay here? She asked. Yes, you live here. You have for a couple of years. But none of it was familiar. I don't know where I am, she said. I don't know who I am. Had I not arrived when I did, she went on to say, she might have screamed. So I wasn't just a caregiver at this phase. Oftentimes, I was nothing short of a lifeline, her sole connection to reality, and she'd cling to me for her dear life. My wife, Debbie, played a critical role during this phase too, and was often there for her when I couldn't be. Leaving to go home or back to work had always been difficult, but it was extra difficult during this phase. On a good day, I'm sure it didn't matter much. Out of sight, out of mind. But I have no doubt that on other days, Mom would feel abandoned and alone again, without any touchstones, any real connections to the world. I shudder to think about it even now. The final phase, release. As I had predicted in the first piece I wrote, where I addressed dementia's tragic promise, things would eventually change for the better, at least subjectively. Mom eventually moved to the Jewish Healthcare Center in Worcester, where she lived for 6 years. And owing to the progression of her disease, she moved beyond the kind of panic and confusion I just described. Seen from the outside, her situation was bleak. In addition to dementia, she had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She was in a wheelchair. Her paper-thin skin was all mottled in black and blue, and she was virtually blind. So there she'd be as we entered, eyes closed, slumped over, maybe dozing, maybe not, hard to tell. I'd walk over and play with her hair a little without saying a word, at which point she might perk up. If there was no response, I might ask, anybody home? And then hopefully she'd know I was there. How did you find me? she might ask. I always find you, Ma. Should we take a little spin? And then we'd go to her room, or if it was a nice day, go outside, take a wheel through the parking lot, or sit by a nice little garden, try to catch up. For a time, she might have gone on to ask questions about me and my life, what I did for a living, whether I was married, whether we had any kids. Sometimes she knew all of this, but generally not. So some measure of reacquaintance was needed. One particularly memorable conversation happened back when I was 57. I responded to all of her questions, of course, but here I just want to share her words in the order they were uttered. So you're my son? Are you married? Do you have any children? And what is your name? So do you like me as a mother? How long have I been your mother? That's a long time not to know you, she said, when I told her it's been 57 years. Wow, she added. Look at all the time I've missed with you. So do you call me Ma? So when did I get to know you? So are you nice? So do I look at you with love? After she received all the answers and knew the lay of the land, she could only conclude, I love being your mom. I love being your son, I said in response. So, she concluded, it's a good match. As I said near the end of the eulogy I gave shortly after her death, I quote, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. There were still some difficult times, and eventually she'd lose much of her vitality. Music could still get to her once in a while, but less and less. And even food, even gooey chocolate, her favorite, would lose its appeal. A few bites and she'd be done. No more. That's when we knew we were in a new phase. There wasn't a whole lot we could do with her in her final days. Often it was hard to know if she was even awake. She'd just sit in her wheelchair, rocking her head up and down, sometimes making a strange noise or spewing out what sounded like nonsense words. She could still hold our hands. She even grabbed them tight sometimes and brought them to her lips. But then she'd loosen her grip and fade away one more time. I wouldn't call those times good, but nor were they bad. They were just times. All I could do, all any of us could do was just take them in, be there with her, be present. That's what I found myself doing the day Rabbi Rudnick called me to let me know she'd taken a turn for the worse. In fact, I found myself coming up with a curious term for what I was doing, or at least what I was trying to do later that day. I was trying to memorize her. Would that it were possible. I concluded the eulogy with these words. Difficult though these years have been, Mom's life was a gift. She helped us stop and attend in love in ways we wouldn't have had she remained healthy. For this, we are immensely grateful. I'd like to think she got something out of it too. Small moments became large and very precious. And even if she couldn't quite remember them, my sense, or at least my hope, is that they took somehow. Given her bountiful love, I'm pretty sure they did. I take a lot of consolation in that. Now your turn, Art.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. You've done a beautiful job of synthesizing those stages. And I'm sure when some of you read the book, you will see the depth and the texture and the connection in each stage. This book had a lot of resonance for me because, like Mark, I spent a good number of years as my mother's caregiver. That fell to me unexpectedly. I never anticipated it. Suddenly, when I moved to Florida, my parents moved to Florida. My father died shortly after. And ultimately, my mother asked me to be her caregiver as she realized her cognitive skills were declining. So much of what you discuss is very close to my own lived experience. And I really thank you for that. And one of the things that comes up, one of the issues that comes up in the book was the reluctance of some of her siblings and other people in your family to visit with her, to come and see her. Yeah. And though you don't really necessarily dwell on that, one of the things I found was I had a lot of anger, especially toward my sister, who refused for much of the last 2 years to come and see her because she didn't want to remember her this way. And I think you may use a similar phrase in your book. And you do, I think, very poignantly point out the connection between having a parent, or it could be a spouse or a sibling with Alzheimer's or with dementia, what it raises about how we understand end of life, and especially its nearness to death. And of course, there is no necessary ending to dementia. I mean, it will end, as you say in the book, it will end for all of us eventually. But to me, it raises the great irony of the human condition, which Ernest Becker discussed so beautifully in The Denial of Death, our deep need to be free of anxiety, the anxiety of death and annihilation. But also suggests that it's life itself that awakens this anxiety, and in many cases makes us shrink from, this is sort of implicit in the way I read your story, makes us shrink from being fully alive in the ways that, in the Buddhist sense of being in the moment suggests. We find it, no matter how much we try to meditate and learn meditation. So I wondered how your connection to those who didn't come progressed, and also your thoughts about this kind of paradox as we get closer to the end, especially with dementia and Alzheimer's. We see those qualities that we associate with being more human disappearing, and those qualities that we connect to being more animal expanding. They're right in front of us. We can touch them, we can feel them, and we can no longer deny them.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
There's a lot to say in response. I guess the first thing that I would say is it's not like I was at ease with all of this from the start. And so the last thing I want people to take away from this is the image of me as some kind of heroic caregiver. Much of the time, especially early on, was extremely frustrating. She could be annoying. She could be very difficult. And it was difficult to face the fact that oftentimes within moments of something significant happening, it was gone. I took her to California once in the middle of all this to see for the last time some of her siblings.
Mm.
And it was a wonderful experience. We got off the plane, and within moments, she had never been to California. So that immediately led me to a kind of shift in my own mind. And it has to do with the idea of memorability. I can tell you that somebody close to me at one point said to me, "What's the point of coming to see her? She's going to forget it immediately anyway." And I could have explained what the point was, and I could have explained that a lot of it just has to do with our ethical and moral being in the world and the kind of respect that needs to be paid to people in that kind of situation.
Yeah.
But for some people, there was a range of things. There was that response, the why bother response. There was also the response, I mentioned this in the book, of one of her sisters. She left us long ago. And I also confessed at one point in the book that there were times early on when I would go to her floor and I would see people miserable, oftentimes suffering, when I would ask myself, what's the point? But I eventually came to think quite differently about that. I had to recalibrate all of that. I had to recalibrate my sense of what constituted a kind of worthwhile life, right? And I didn't want to enshrine our situation. I didn't want to romanticize it, hardly. I had to ratchet everything down. I had to learn. I had to learn to let go of expectations. I had to learn to let go of some of what was right in front of me, but I also had to learn to just attend to what was right in front of me. And on some level, I was fortunate to be within 2 miles of her place. If somebody came to see my mother after not having seen her for a year or 2 years, they would often be horrified. They would leave crying and sobbing. So there was that juxtaposition of the vibrant woman she had been with this new version. But we got to be there all along the way.
Yeah.
In many respects, I feel like we came to see some of the rhythms of nature, as you put it.
Well, and I like what you just said. We go back to like the canonical narrative of Alzheimer's and dementia, being that this is the worst thing that can happen,
Right.
Short of an extended painful cancer, perhaps.
Right.
But it is such a strong canonical narrative that it is horrifying. You are already prepared to find it horrifying. You are
Absolutely.
most prepared. You aren't prepared to do what you do so beautifully at points in your book of finding the beauty and the comedy, even in moments of it. And instead, it's horrifying. It's horrible. And in that, the consequences for me, at least the way I look at it, is it makes it so hard on new caregivers like yourself or
Right.
any others. And I think your book will be, I think a major contribution to this if people read it, potential caregivers or new caregivers read it. Let me tell you about one thing I used to do about the last year and a half. My mother was in nursing home the last 2 years, and I would drive over to the nursing home, which was a much further distance than you had. It was about 20 some miles across the causeway. And before I went in, I would sit in the parking lot in the car, and I would purposely think about the sliding doors at the nursing home as almost like a proscenium stage, insofar as I am coming out of this world and going into that world, into what Berger and Luckman used to call a finite province of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And when I enter that, that's why I'm there. And then the second thing was, this is not for me. This is for you, Mom.
That's right.
This is for you.
Yeah.
And those two simple things helped me immensely. I'm not saying that I was perfect in any way, or that I didn't experience a lot of the wavering feelings running through me that you so well expressed. But I think as a caregiver, and someone who wanted to show love, however fleeting it was for her, that was important. And of course, I had Carolyn to help me and to advise me in many of these cases. So those are just some thoughts I had.
Yeah. Well, I very much connect to the idea of entering into this finite province of meaning, and letting go of all of the daily stuff that clutter our mind. In that sense, being with her became a kind of meditation in a way. But that's not all. You may recall the point in the book where I said, I think I was a better person when she was alive. In the following way, and that is, I was engaged in a practice for a number of years, where upon entering that finite space, I was there for her, unequivocally, and it could mean something as simple as sitting in the sun, feeling the warmth, holding her hand, whatever. So several times a week, I would be going there and, again, not in a heroic way, but just giving myself over to the situation and to her. And of course, when she passed, I no longer had that. I no longer had that. And so that practice, that routine, that discipline stopped, and so on. So, I mean, I don't mean to say that there was a radical change between what I was like then and what I'm like now. But
Well, it's an interesting point, and so much of the book does focus on, I guess, what R.D. Laing might have called your experience of her experience, right? And I did wonder, and this came up in the keynote this morning. And of course, any writer has to make all kinds of choices. You have a limited space. People don't like longer books anymore anyway. But you make certain choices about what you're going to include and what you're going to leave out. And I wondered about So there were these 4 stages in your mother's experience, the stages in your experience. So how you were changed, the kind of person you are now as a consequence of going through that experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. And, you know, on the one hand, you'd never want to wish this sort of situation on anyone. That's the tragic part of it. There's no question, though, but that, well, 2 things. One is that she and I had a level of encounter and just relational intimacy of a sort that we never would have had she remained healthy. We would have gotten together for a dinner and knocked down a gin and tonic or done whatever, and then returned to our respective homes and so on. So, I mean, it's odd to think of it this way. It's odd to think that her dementia was the requisite condition for that intimacy to develop. But in terms of myself, the phases, I mean, I've never named those phases, but some of them had to do with moving beyond some of my own impatience, my own emotional, if not volatility. You know, I found myself in situations, for instance, where I would sometimes just get annoyed at her, pissed at her. And then I'd feel like a complete schmuck because I knew rationally speaking that she couldn't do otherwise. And so I came face to face with some of my own kind of primitivity in a way. Like, good God, Freeman, look at what you're doing. So to by degrees learn how to modulate those visceral responses. That's one thing. Learning how to truly be present is another. Learning how to find in the seemingly insignificant, you know, the quotidian. Learning to find, I don't know whether to call it meaning, but certainly learning to find value in that. I'm not sure if value is the right word either. So yeah, there was definitely, you know, a personal transformation on my end too. Somebody just asked, let me take a quick look at the chat.
Yeah, we should. Yeah.
Did I feel a sense of relief? No, I don't think so. It was more a sense of culmination. I mean, at no point, for instance, did I say like, you know, well, I'm glad that's done with. And truthfully, at no point did I or my wife think of this or experience this as some kind of burden. I mean, people would often say to us, oh, what must it be like? And oh, it must be so difficult.
Right, there's that narrative.
You know, and for us, it's not that it wasn't difficult at times, but for us, we often just said to people, it's just life. It's just life. This is right. It can move. And we're moving with it. And you don't need to sympathize, you know, about our plight. You don't need to enshrine us for our heroism. Just it's just human stuff. It's just human stuff. So let me put on my glasses and look at the chat.
Is there anyone?
Yeah, and just a quick comment. The comment that's made, you know, you visit them. Part of the reason you go is because you need to visit them for what it brings yourself. Not that's undoubtedly true. And there were all kinds of reasons like that for why I went to see her, because I felt good about it, because it upheld the kind of image of being a son that I wanted to uphold, and so on. But if you were to ask me, did I do it in order to feel good? I think the answer to that would be no. I think the answer to that would be no. Feeling good about being with her was often a consequence of being there for her, right? But the fact is, when I often got on the elevator to leave her, I felt kind of crappy. And the reason for that is that I knew that she would be alone again with no connection to the world. And so, in any case, you're perfectly right to suggest that some of all this I'm implicated in. I did it for me, but there's an authentic priority of the other thing going on as well. I saw another question. Whew. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Anybody?
I had a question,
Uh,
Chris.
Yes? Who's,
Well, first of all, Mark, I just want to say your writing is so beautiful. I want to buy your books now. So you sold me. What I wanted to say or ask about was really something I've been thinking about a lot. My wife was the caregiver for her mom, who had dementia for her last 5 years of her life. And she did it long distance between North Carolina and Colorado, where her mom lived in an assisted living facility. And more recently, my mom doesn't have dementia, but she lives close by. My sister is her caregiver because she's had a significant sight loss through macular degeneration, so she can't get around in the world. And as I've spent time hanging out with my mom, it started striking me so poignantly, less about the experience of the people who are giving care and much about the experience of the person suffering what I would consider, from talking to them, a really poignant sense of loss on their own part. It was harder with my mother-in-law, as you described, through the dementia, because she wouldn't remember that. But it strikes me that there's this side of it that's just the poignancy of their sense of aloneness and losing some big things. And I don't know if you have more to say about that, or how you would.
Yeah, I mean, I write about that a fair amount, especially in the chapter called Protest. It's at the earliest phases that she felt that loss most acutely. And, that very simple response, when she said in response to me, "I want to be a person," really says that. I want to be somebody who is not compromised and confused and lost, and that and the dislocation phase, those two phases were the hardest. And in some ways, it was a perverse realization that I had at one point, when I said, she's going to be better off when she moves beyond this, when she no longer has an awareness of her own loss. So, I remember giving a talk in the middle of all this, and I wound up saying, it's hard to know what to hope for. It's hard to know what to hope for. You don't want to hope for just continued demise, inexorable though that is. And yet it's precisely with that demise, that quote, loss of self, that some of her own feelings of loss were set aside. She didn't have those feelings for the final 5 years of her life. And nor did she miss me when I walked out the door. Right? Was there a part of her that knew inside that something was radically amiss, that she wasn't who she had been?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very, very complicated. It's very, very complicated. I mean, here's an example of how complicated it was. My mother was virtually blind, but she didn't know it. And so when I would walk in or I would come in to see her with my kids and so forth, she would say, you look, you all look so great. You look so beautiful. It's, right? But if I pointed to the corner of the room and said, Ma, can you tell me where the television is? No idea. So I think she had no memory of what a seeing person was, actually. But she had ideas about somehow what it means to encounter people in the world. So she didn't have any sense of loss over her own blindness or her own infirmity or anything. She just existed. So let me offer a quick response. I know time is, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that that you were implying that there's a kind of selfishness involved in speaking to Lucy here. And I think to frame it in terms of humility and so forth, and what we can learn from this kind of experience is more what I would want to speak to. So I do appreciate that comment. Scanning the messages. Hey, Ken.
Chaba, you had a question on the comment?
Well, I was just interested, like, how does this experience shape the view on your own mortality? Because I am, ministering people, and I frequently visiting the nursing homes, and I often feel that it is incredibly helpful for me to face my own mortality or face a similar situation that I have to go through, having this experience with another person.
Yeah. I don't know that I arrived at any large epiphanies regarding my own mortality and how I relate to it. It was more of a kind of seeping process. And Art, you may remember this at one point in the book. I actually mentioned a brief meditation that was delivered by, of all people, Freud.
Yeah.
On transience, and it's a lovely little piece. He's walking through the woods with a poet, and the poet, by all indications, is Rilke. And Rilke is looking at, it's the winter and everything is dying, and for him it's bleak. The fact that everything passes is just so awful in a way. And Freud chimes in and he says, no, it's precisely the transience of all things that renders it precious. And so I don't know whether this speaks to the issue of my own mortality. I do believe, well, I know that I came to find a kind of beauty in mortality that I really hadn't entertained before. The last chapter of the book is called Death, Dementia, and the Face of the Divine. And I do address the idea of the beautiful there. And of course, it's not the beautiful as it's often discussed in conventional standard terms, people who look like this or look like that. At one point, I refer to it as the beauty of nature. stark and real.
Uh,
And so that's how I see it. And is it going to make my own mortality easier? Probably not. Anyway.
The next session will be coming into this room in a couple of minutes. So before we conclude, I wanted to hold up this copy of the book. Do I Look at You with Love? Reimagining the Story of Dementia. And it's published by Brill. And you can find it on Amazon, or you can email Mark, or wherever you have booksellers, you can ask them to get you a copy. It is a terrific read. And I think I'll end this session with one of the last sentences. Well, it's the last sentence in the paragraph, in the next to last paragraph of the book, because I think it's a beautiful sentence. Nothing was more important, nothing was more necessary than just being there together, breathing in the bittersweet air of life, and eventually death. Thank you.
Thanks.
And if you have other comments, you can email Mark, he's not hard to find, or me, and I'll pass it on, or whatever. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Mark, for a really inspiring session.
Thanks to all of you for being here. Greatly appreciated.